the mountain man stood in the dusty street of Salida, Colorado, watching the horse trader's lips move with numbers that made no sense, and he knew right then, in the summer heat of 1878, that he was about to lose more money than he could afford. Xander Dalton had come down from his cabin in the Sawatch Range with enough pelts and dried meat to trade for supplies that would last him through the coming winter. He had also brought something precious, $120 in gold coins, carefully saved over 3 years of trapping and trading. He needed a pack horse, something sturdy enough to carry his goods back up the mountain trails, and the trader in the dusty corral had exactly what he thought he needed. The horse was a dappled gray mare, strong-looking with good legs, and the trader had started at $100, which already seemed steep, but Xander was not a man of commerce. He was a man of the wilderness, of snow-covered peaks and silent forests, of tracking elk through pine groves and setting beaver traps in ice-cold streams. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt, arms thick with muscle from swinging axes and hauling carcasses, and dark brown hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in a neat beard and eyes the color of storm clouds. He knew how to survive in conditions that would kill most men, but he did not know how to haggle with a snake-tongued trader who smiled too wide and spoke too fast. "100 is my final offer," the trader said, a thin man with greasy hair and tobacco-stained teeth. "This here is the finest mountain horse you will find between here and Denver. Strong back, good temperament, sure-footed on trails. You will not find better." Xander looked at the mare again, running his hand along her flank. She seemed sound enough, though he noticed she favored her left rear leg just slightly when she shifted her weight. He did not know if that was significant or just the way she stood. He opened his mouth to agree to the price, already counting out the coins in his mind, when a voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife through butter. "That horse is not worth more than $60, and we both know it." Xander turned to see a woman approaching the corral, and for a moment he forgot about the horse entirely. She was perhaps 24 or 25, wearing a simple calico dress that had seen better days, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of new grass. She was not tall, probably barely reaching his shoulder, but she moved with confidence and purpose, her chin raised and her gaze fixed on the horse trader with unmistakable determination. "Now see here, Miss Ashford," the trader sputtered, his face reddening. "This is between me and the gentleman. You have no business interfering." "I have every business when I see someone about to be robbed in broad daylight," the woman said, stopping at the corral fence and placing her hands on her hips. "That mare has a strained tendon in her rear left leg. She is at least 15 years old based on her teeth, and she has saddle sores that have not healed properly. $60 is generous." The trader's face went from red to purple. "You do not know what you are talking about. This horse is 8 years old at most, and there is nothing wrong with her legs." "Then you will not mind if I examine her," the woman said, not waiting for permission before she ducked between the fence rails and approached the mare. The horse nickered softly, and the woman ran her hands expertly along the animal's legs, then gently opened her mouth to check her teeth. Xander watched, fascinated, as she performed an examination more thorough than his own had been. 15 years, as I said," she announced, straightening up. "And this tendon is swollen. She can still work, but she needs rest and treatment first, and she will never be able to carry as much weight as a younger horse. Mister, if you pay $100 for this animal, you are throwing away $40. Xander looked from the woman to the trader, who was now sweating despite the shade of his hat. "Is what she says true?" he asked. "Miss Ashford has always had opinions about horses," the trader said weakly. "But I assure you, I worked at a stable in St. Louis for 6 years before coming west," the woman interrupted. "I know horses better than most men know their own wives. This mare is old and injured, and while she can still be useful, she is not worth $100. 60 is fair for both of you." The trader looked like he wanted to argue more, but something in the woman's steady gaze seemed to deflate him. "Fine," he muttered, $60. "But I want it known that I am losing money on this deal. You are getting exactly what the horse is worth," the woman said calmly. She turned to Xander, and he found himself looking into those green eyes and forgetting momentarily how to speak. "You should pay him, get your horse, and make sure to rest her for at least a week before putting any serious weight on her back. I can show you how to wrap that tendon if you do not know." "I do not," Xander admitted, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "I would appreciate that." The trader took the $60 in gold coins with poor grace, handed over the mare's lead rope, and stalked off, muttering under his breath. Xander stood holding the rope, very aware that the woman was still standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin. "Thank you," he said. "You just saved me $40. "You are welcome," she said, giving him a small smile that made something in his chest tighten. "I hate to see good people cheated, and Silas Thompson has been overcharging travelers for years. Someone needs to keep him honest." "I am Xander Dalton," he said, offering his hand. When she placed her smaller hand in his, he was careful not to squeeze too hard, though he could feel calluses on her palm that spoke of hard work. "I live up in the mountains." "I do not come to town often." "Margaret Ashford," she replied. "Most people call me Maggie. I run a boarding house on the east end of town with my aunt, and I help out at the livery stable when they need an extra hand." "I am grateful you were passing by," Xander said. "I know animals, but I do not know horses the way you seem to. I would have paid that money and thought I got a fair deal." "Thompson counts on that," Maggie said, her expression darkening. "He looks for people who do not know better. Mountain men, farmers, people new to the territory. It makes me furious." She looked furious, Xander thought, and also beautiful. He had not had much contact with women in recent years. Life in the mountains was solitary, and he came to Salida only twice a year to trade and resupply. There had been women before, back when he lived in Kansas, but no one who had made him want to stay in one place. No one who had looked at a horse with such confidence and stood up to a cheating trader without a hint of fear. "You said you could show me how to wrap the leg," he asked, not wanting her to leave just yet. "Of course," Maggie said. "Do you have somewhere to keep her tonight? She should not travel far until that tendon has been treated." "I was planning to head back up the mountain today," Xander admitted, "but I suppose I can wait. Is there a stable that would board her?" "Miller's livery, where I help out sometimes," Maggie said. "Come on, I will walk with you. It is just 3 streets over." They walked together through the dusty streets of Salida, the mare following docilely behind Xander. The town was not large, perhaps 300 people, but it was growing. The railroad had not reached them yet, but there was talk it would within the next few years, and that was bringing new businesses and new residents. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their false fronts painted in fading colors. A general store, a saloon, a doctor's office, a church with a white steeple. Women in bonnets carried baskets, men in work clothes hauled lumber and supplies, and somewhere a dog was barking. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Maggie asked as they walked. 5 years, Xander said. "I came west from Kansas after the war. I tried farming for a while, but I am not made for staying in one place, plowing the same fields year after year. The mountains suit me better." "It must be lonely," Maggie said, glancing up at him. "Sometimes," Xander admitted, "but there is a freedom up there that I cannot find anywhere else. No one telling me what to do or how to live, just me and the wilderness." "And what made you come down to town today?" "Needed supplies for winter," Xander said. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. And I needed a pack horse because my old mule died last spring. I thought I had saved enough money, but if I had paid $100 for this mare, I would have had to leave half my supplies behind. Then I am glad I came along when I did," Maggie said. There was something in her voice, a warmth that made Xander look at her more closely. She was watching the street ahead. But there was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They reached the livery stable, a large wooden structure that smelled of hay and horses and leather. An older man with a gray beard came out to greet them, and his face lit up when he saw Maggie. "Miss Maggie," he said warmly, "what brings you by today?" "This gentleman needs to board his mare overnight, Mr. Miller," Maggie said, "and she needs some treatment for a strained tendon. I told him I would show him how to wrap it." Of course," Miller said. He looked at Xander with interest. "You're the mountain man who brings down pelts, are you not? I have seen you before." "That is me," Xander confirmed. "Well, any friend of Miss Maggie's is welcome here," Miller said. "Boarding is $2 a night. It includes feed and water." Xander paid the fee and led the mare into a clean stall. Maggie asked Miller for bandages and liniment, then rolled up her sleeves and showed Xander exactly how to clean the swollen tendon, apply the medicine, and wrap it securely. Her hands were gentle but efficient, and the mare stood quietly through the whole process. "You do this every day for a week," Maggie instructed. "Twice a day if you can. Keep her from bearing too much weight, and the swelling should go down. After that, she will be fine for light work, but do not overload her. She is not a young horse." I will remember, Xander said, watching her hands as she demonstrated the wrapping technique again. You are good at this. I have always loved horses, Maggie said, a note of wistfulness in her voice. When I was a girl in St. Louis, I spent every free moment at the stables near our house. The owner finally took pity on me and gave me a job mucking out stalls. I worked my way up from there. What brought you to Colorado? Xander asked, Maggie's expression clouded. My parents died of fever 3 years ago. My aunt was my only living relative, and she had moved out here to open a boarding house after her husband passed. She wrote and offered me a home, so I came west. It was start over here, or try to survive alone in St. Louis, and I thought Colorado sounded like an adventure. Has it been? Xander asked gently. Sometimes, Maggie said, meeting his eyes. And sometimes it is just hard work and loneliness, same as anywhere else. But I do not regret coming. There is something about this place, this wildness that feels right. Xander understood exactly what she meant. He had felt that same pull, that same sense of rightness when he first came to the mountains. It was rare to meet someone who felt it too. They finished with the mare, and Xander found himself reluctant to say goodbye. Can I buy you dinner? He asked, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. To thank you for your help. Maggie looked surprised, then pleased. I would like that, she said. There is a decent restaurant on Main Street. The food is simple but good. I do not need fancy, Xander said. Simple sounds perfect. They walked back through town to the restaurant, which was a small establishment run by a Chinese family. The smells coming from the kitchen made Xander's stomach growl, reminding him that he had not eaten since dawn. They sat at a table near the window, and Xander felt oversized in the small chair, like a bear trying to sit at a tea party. Maggie seemed amused by his discomfort. You are not used to being indoors, are you? She asked. Not particularly, Xander admitted. My cabin is small and I spend most of my time outside. This feels confining. I can imagine, Maggie said, though I confess, the idea of living alone in the wilderness sounds terrifying to me. What do you do when you are hurt or sick? What do you do when winter storms come? I prepare as best I can, Xander said. I keep supplies stockpiled. I know which plants are medicinal, and I have learned to be careful. As for the loneliness, I have my traps to check, animals to hunt, wood to chop. There is always something to do. But no people to talk to, Maggie pointed out. No one to share a meal with or tell about your day. That would drive me mad. Xander shrugged. I suppose I am used to it. I have never been much of a talker anyway. You are talking now, Maggie said with a smile. That is different, Xander said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Talking to Maggie felt natural, comfortable in a way that conversation rarely did for him. You are easy to talk to. Thank you, Maggie said softly. So are you. They ordered food, simple beef stew with bread, and talked while they ate. Maggie told him about the boarding house, which was struggling to stay open because Salida was not yet large enough to have many travelers passing through. She told him about her aunt, a stern but kind woman who had taught her to be independent and self-sufficient. She told him about helping at the livery stable, which did not pay much, but allowed her to be around the horses she loved. Xander told her about the mountains, about tracking elk through snow, about the crystal-clear lakes hidden in high valleys, about the way the sunrise looked from a ridge 10,000 feet above sea level. He told her about the challenges too, the brutal winters and dangerous wildlife, the isolation that could weigh on a person if they let it. You make it sound beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, Maggie said when he paused. That is what it is, Xander said. Beautiful and terrifying. Not many people can handle it. Could I? Maggie asked, and there was something in her eyes that made his heart beat faster. I think you could, Xander said honestly. You are tougher than you look. I will take that as a compliment, Maggie said with a laugh. When they finished eating, Xander walked Maggie back to her boarding house, a 2-story wooden building that looked well-maintained despite its age. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the evening air was cooling. Thank you for dinner, Maggie said when they reached her door, and for the conversation. I enjoyed it. So did I, Xander said. He hesitated, not wanting the evening to end. I will be in town for at least a week to treat the mare's leg. Could I see you again? Maggie's face lit up. I would like that very much. I am usually at the livery stable in the mornings if you need to treat the horse. And if you want company, I will be there, Xander promised. He watched her go inside, then walked back to the livery stable where Miller had offered to let him sleep in the hayloft for no charge. As he climbed the ladder and spread out his bedroll, Xander found himself thinking about green eyes and auburn hair, about a woman who knew horses and was not afraid to stand up to cheaters. He had come to town expecting to buy supplies and leave, but now he found himself grateful for a strained tendon that would keep him here longer. The next morning, Xander woke early out of habit and went to check on the mare. He was pleased to see the swelling in her leg had already gone down slightly. He was applying fresh liniment when Maggie arrived, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I thought you might be hungry, so I brought breakfast." She uncovered the basket to reveal fresh biscuits, fried eggs wrapped in cloth to stay warm, and strips of bacon. Xander's eyes widened. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know," Maggie said, "but I wanted to. Consider it further thanks for letting me help with your horse. I do not get to work with them as much as I would like." They sat on hay bales and ate breakfast together, talking easily. Maggie asked more questions about mountain life, and Xander found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, about the peace he felt in the wilderness, about the way time moved differently when you were alone with nature. "It sounds like you have found where you belong," Maggie said thoughtfully. "I thought I had," Xander said, looking at her. "But lately I have been thinking that maybe something is missing." "What?" Maggie asked softly. "Someone to share it with," Xander admitted. "Someone who would understand why I need the wildness, but who would also remind me that I am still human, still connected to the world." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "That is a very specific thing to need," she said finally. "I suppose it is," Xander agreed, "which is why I have never found it." They looked at each other, and Xander felt something shift between them, something electric and undeniable. He wanted to reach out and touch her face, to see if her skin was as soft as it looked, but he held back. It was too soon, and he did not want to frighten her. Over the next several days they fell into a pattern. Xander would tend to the mare in the morning, and Maggie would bring breakfast. They would work together, treating the horse's leg, and then walk through town talking about everything and nothing. Xander bought his supplies slowly, stretching out his errands to give himself more time in Salida. Maggie introduced him to her aunt, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, who looked him up and down appraisingly, before declaring that he seemed like a decent sort, which Xander took as high praise. On the 5th day, Maggie asked if he would come to dinner at the boarding house. "My aunt wants to get to know you better," she said, "and I confess I would like to cook for you. I am told I make an excellent pot roast." "I would be honored," Xander said. That evening, he showed up at the boarding house, freshly washed and wearing his cleanest shirt, which was still worn buckskin but at least did not smell of smoke and pine. Maggie answered the door, wearing a green dress that brought out her eyes, and Xander felt his breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said, then felt his face heat at his own boldness. "Thank you," Maggie said, blushing. "Come in." Dinner was indeed excellent, and Aunt Dorothy proved to be entertaining company, telling stories about the early days of Salida, when it had been nothing but a handful of tents and false hope. After the meal, Maggie and Xander walked out to the small porch, where they could watch the stars come out over the mountains. "The mare's leg is almost healed," Maggie said quietly. "You will be leaving soon." "I will need to," Xander said, though the thought filled him with unexpected sadness. "Winter comes early in the high country. I need to get my supplies up to the cabin before the first snow." "I understand," Maggie said, but he could hear the disappointment in her voice. "Come with me," Xander said suddenly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Come see the mountains. See where I live. Just for a few days. I can bring you back before winter sets in." Maggie turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "You want me to come to your cabin?" "I want you to see it," Xander said. "I want you to understand what my life is like. And I want to spend more time with you before I have to leave." "Xander, I cannot just disappear into the mountains with a man I barely know," Maggie said, though she sounded more uncertain than firm. "Bring your aunt as chaperone," Xander suggested, "or bring Mr. Miller. I do not care who comes with us as long as you come too." Maggie bit her lip, thinking, "My aunt would never leave the boarding house for that long, but Miller might agree to come. He is always talking about wanting to see the high country before he gets too old." "Then ask him," Xander said. "Please. I know it is a lot to ask, but Maggie, I cannot leave without you seeing what I am trying to explain." "Words are not enough. You could stay here," Maggie said softly. "In Salida, there is work for a man with your skills. You could guide hunting parties, work at the lumber mill, trap closer to town." "I could," Xander acknowledged, "but would that be fair to either of us? To ask me to give up the life I love before you have even seen it? Before you know if it is something you could be part of? Maggie was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You are right, I need to see it, and you need to know if I can handle it. I will ask Mr. Miller tomorrow. Miller agreed with surprising enthusiasm, declaring that he had been waiting for an excuse to explore the high country for years. They made plans to leave in 2 days, as soon as the mare was fully ready to travel. Xander bought additional supplies for the journey, and Maggie packed a bag with practical clothing and warm layers. The morning they left, Aunt Dorothy stood on the porch of the boarding house with her arms crossed, watching them prepare. You take care of my niece, she said to Xander, her voice stern but her eyes kind. And you, she said to Maggie, remember that you always have a home here, no matter what you decide. I will be back in a week, Aunt Dorothy, Maggie said, hugging her tightly. I promise. They rode out of Salida as the sun was rising, Xander on his own mount, Maggie on a borrowed horse from the livery, and Miller on a sturdy gelding, with the mare carrying supplies. The trail led west and then north, climbing steadily into the foothills and then higher, into the true mountains. Maggie rode well, Xander noted with approval. She sat her horse confidently and did not complain when the trail became steep and rocky. Miller, despite his age, kept up without difficulty, clearly enjoying the adventure. They stopped for lunch beside a rushing stream, the water so clear that Xander could see every stone on the bottom. It is beautiful, Maggie said, looking around at the pine trees and rocky peaks. I have never been this far from town. This is still the easy part, Xander said. Tomorrow we climb higher. That night they made camp in a meadow filled with wildflowers. Xander showed Maggie how to build a proper fire and how to hang their food supplies so bears could not reach them. They cooked simple food over the flames, beans and salted pork, and wrapped themselves in blankets as the temperature dropped. It gets cold at night, Maggie observed, shivering slightly. Wait until you see it in winter, Xander said. This is warm compared to January. How do you stand it? Maggie asked. You learn to respect the cold, Xander said. You prepare for it, you dress properly, you build good fires, and you appreciate the silence, the beauty of snow on the peaks, the way everything becomes clean and pure. Miller, sitting across the fire, chuckled. You sound like a poet, Mr. Dalton. The mountains make poets of men, Xander said with a smile, or they break them, not much in between. The second day was harder, the trail steeper and more treacherous. Several times they had to dismount and lead the horses over particularly rough sections. Maggie never complained, though Xander could see the effort in her face. When they stopped for breaks, she would immediately go to check the horses, making sure they were not strained or injured by the climb. Late in the afternoon they crested a ridge and Xander's cabin came into view. It was not much, a single-room log structure with a stone chimney, situated beside a lake so blue it looked unreal. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still capped with snow even in late summer. This is it, Xander said, watching Maggie's face carefully. This is home. Maggie stared at the view, her eyes wide. It is magnificent, she breathed. Xander, this is like something from a dream. Relief flooded through him. He had been afraid she would find it too rough, too isolated. Instead, she looked enchanted. They settled the horses and went inside the cabin. It was sparse but clean, with a bed built into one corner, a table and chairs, shelves holding supplies, and a stone fireplace. Xander had Miller sleep on the bed while he gave Maggie his bedroll and took blankets for himself by the fire. It was not proper, all of them under one roof, but there were no neighbors for miles to judge. Over the next 3 days, Xander showed Maggie his world. He took her to check his trap lines, though he did not set any traps with her watching, not wanting to upset her. He showed her how to read animal tracks, how to find water sources, how to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. He took her fishing in the lake, and her delight when she caught a trout made him laugh, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. Miller mostly stayed at the cabin, claiming his old bones needed rest, though Xander suspected the man was deliberately giving them time alone together. In the evenings, they all sat by the fire and talked, but during the days, it was just Xander and Maggie, exploring the high country together. On the third afternoon, they climbed to a viewpoint above the lake where they could see for miles in every direction. Maggie stood at the edge, looking out over the wilderness, and Xander stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I understand now, Maggie said quietly, why you need this, why you cannot give it up. And, Xander asked, his heart in his throat. And I do not want you to, Maggie said, turning to face him. This place is part of who you are. Asking you to leave it would be like asking you to cut off your own arm. But you could not live here, Xander said, stating what he thought was obvious. It is too hard, too isolated. You need people, community, your aunt. Is that what you think? Maggie asked, and there was something fierce in her eyes. That I am too weak for this life? Not weak, Xander said quickly, but you have only been here 3 days in good weather, with everything prepared for you. Winter is brutal. Sometimes I do not see another human face for months. Sometimes the snow is so deep I cannot leave the cabin for days. Sometimes the loneliness is so complete it feels like physical pain, and yet you stay, Maggie said, because the beauty outweighs the hardship. Xander said, because I would rather be lonely here than surrounded by people in a place that does not feel right. What if you were not lonely? Maggie asked softly. What if someone was here with you? Xander's breath caught. Maggie, you cannot mean that. You have a life in Salida, responsibility. I have a dying boarding house and an aunt who is more than capable of running it without me, Maggie said. I have a part-time job at a livery stable that pays barely enough to matter. What I do not have is anything that makes me feel the way I felt these past 3 days, free, alive. Like I finally found where I am supposed to be. You barely know me, Xander protested, even as hope flared in his chest. I know enough, Maggie said. I know you are honest and kind. I know you saved me $40 from a cheating horse trader, even though you did not mean to. I know you respect the land and the animals. I know you make me laugh and make me think and make me want to be brave enough to choose an impossible life just because it feels right. It would not be easy, Xander warned. We would have to marry for propriety's sake and for legal protection. We would have to prepare carefully for winter. You would have to learn so many new skills, how to shoot, how to preserve food, how to survive when things go wrong. I am a fast learner, Maggie said. And yes, we would have to marry. Is that a proposal, Xander Dalton? Xander felt a smile spreading across his face, the first real smile in longer than he could remember. I suppose it is, though I do not have a ring and I am making a terrible job of it. I do not need a ring, Maggie said. I just need you to tell me that you want this, that you want me here with you. I want you here more than I have ever wanted anything, Xander said, and it was true, truer than anything he had ever said. I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I want to teach you everything I know and learn everything you can teach me. I want to share this life with you, the beauty and the hardship, all of it. Then yes, Maggie said, tears shining in her eyes. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will come live in these impossible mountains and learn to be a mountain woman. Yes to all of it. Xander pulled her into his arms, careful of his strength, and kissed her with all the pent-up longing of the past week. She kissed him back fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for a long moment the whole world narrowed to just the two of them on that mountain peak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maggie laughed. My aunt is going to think I have lost my mind. Probably, Xander agreed. But Miller will vouch for me. He has seen the cabin, seen how I live. He can tell her I am not completely insane. Just partially insane, Maggie said with a grin. I can live with that. They returned to the cabin to find Miller sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe and looking pleased with himself. Took you too long enough, he said when they announced their plans. I was beginning to think I would have to spell it out for you. You knew? Maggie asked, surprised. My dear girl, everyone with eyes knew, Miller said. The question was whether you would both be brave enough to do something about it. I am glad to see you are. They spent one more night at the cabin, making plans and talking logistics. Xander would come back to Salida with them, and they would marry as soon as possible. Maggie would need to pack her belongings and say goodbye to her aunt. Xander would sell his extra pelts and buy additional supplies for 2 people instead of 1. They would need warmer clothes for Maggie, more food stores, additional ammunition and medicine. It is going to be tight financially, Xander admitted. That $40 you saved me is going to make all the difference. See? Maggie said. I was meant to be there that day. Fate arranged it. I am beginning to believe in fate, Xander said, pulling her close. The journey back to Salida felt both too long and too short. They talked constantly, planning their future, discussing what Maggie would need to learn and what Xander would need to teach. Miller offered advice based on his own years in the wilderness and proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge. When they rode into Salida a week after they had left, Aunt Dorothy was waiting on the porch, her face tight with worry. But when she saw Maggie's glowing expression and the way Xander rode protectively close to her niece, her expression softened. So you are going to do something foolish, Dorothy said after they had dismounted and explained everything. Probably, Maggie agreed, but it is the right kind of foolish. Dorothy looked at Xander for a long moment. her eyes sharp and assessing. "Can you keep her safe?" she asked bluntly. "I will do everything in my power to protect her," Xander said. "But I will not lie to you. The mountains are dangerous. There are risks I cannot eliminate. All I can promise is that I will love her, provide for her, and never take her safety for granted." "That is a better answer than most men would give," Dorothy said. She turned to Maggie. "Are you sure about this? Truly sure? You can still change your mind." "I am sure," Maggie said firmly. "More sure than I have been about anything in my life." Dorothy sighed, then nodded. "Then I will not stand in your way, but you will write to me. Every month you will send a letter down with traders or travelers. I need to know you are alive and well." "I promise," Maggie said, hugging her aunt tightly. "Thank you for understanding." The next days were a whirlwind of activity. Xander met with the town's minister and arranged for a simple wedding ceremony. Maggie packed her belongings, which were not extensive, and went through her wardrobe with Dorothy to determine what would be practical for mountain life. Most of her nice dresses were left behind in favor of sturdy work clothes and warm layers. The wedding took place 5 days after they returned, in the small church with its white steeple. Aunt Dorothy stood up for Maggie, and Miller stood up for Xander. There were a few other townspeople present, curious about the mountain man who had swept up Miss Ashford so suddenly, but it was a small, intimate affair. Xander wore his best buckskins, cleaned and brushed until they almost looked respectable. Maggie wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xander kissed her gently, very aware of the watching audience, and felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like coming home. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in a room Dorothy had prepared for them, and Xander was tender and careful with Maggie, mindful of her inexperience. She was shy at first but also eager, and when they finally lay together afterward, tangled in sheets in each other, Xander felt a contentment he had never known. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, stroking her hair. "Nah," Maggie murmured against his chest. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." They left for the mountains 3 days later, their pack horses laden with supplies. Aunt Dorothy cried, but tried to hide it, pressing a packet of letters into Maggie's hands. "I wrote down everything I could think of that might help you," she said. "Recipes, remedies, advice. Read them when you need guidance, and I am not there to give it." "I will treasure them," Maggie promised. The journey back up the mountain took 4 days, moving slower because of the heavy loads. But this time, Maggie knew where they were going, and her excitement grew with every mile. When they finally reached the cabin, she jumped down from her horse and spun around, arms outstretched. "Home," she said, and the word was full of joy. Xander felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Home," he agreed. They spent the next weeks preparing for winter. Xander taught Maggie how to shoot his rifle, and she proved to be a natural, her eye steady, and her hands sure. He taught her how to skin and butcher game, how to smoke meat and preserve vegetables. He taught her how to read the weather, how to track animals, how to move quietly through the forest. Maggie proved to be an excellent student and also an excellent teacher. She showed Xander more efficient ways to organize his supplies, helped him repair his cabin's roof where it had been leaking, and taught him how to make bread that was actually edible instead of the rock-hard bricks he had been baking. They worked side by side during the days and held each other at night, and Xander had never been happier. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years vanished completely, replaced by the warm presence of his wife. When the first snow fell in late October, they were ready. The cabin was stocked with enough food to last until spring. Firewood was stacked high against the outer wall, and they had laid in extra blankets and warm clothes. They watched the snow fall from the cabin's single window, Maggie's back pressed against Xander's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly. "No," Maggie said. "I am with you. Why would I be frightened?" Winter was indeed brutal, just as Xander had warned. There were days when the wind howled so fiercely they could barely hear each other speak. Days when the snow piled so high they had to dig a tunnel from the door to the woodpile. There were days when the cold was so intense that even with the fire roaring they could see their breath inside the cabin. But there were also days of pristine beauty, when the sun shone on fresh snow and turned the world into a crystal palace. There were nights when the northern lights danced across the sky in ribbons of green and gold. There were quiet mornings when they woke tangled together in the warmth of their bed, the rest of the world silent and still. Maggie never complained, though Xander knew it was harder than she had anticipated. She grew thinner as the winter wore on, as they all did when rations had to be stretched. Her hands became chapped and rough from constant work. But she also grew stronger, more confident, more at home in the wilderness. In January, a blizzard trapped them inside for 9 straight days. They played card games Maggie had brought from Salida, told each other stories, and made love to pass the time and keep warm. On the 10th day, when the storm finally broke and they could dig themselves out, they stood outside in the brilliant sunshine, holding hands and laughing at the sheer relief of being able to move again. "That was the longest 9 days of my life," Maggie said. "Mine too," Xander agreed, "and I have been through winter up here alone. Having you with me made it both better and worse." "Worse?" Maggie asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I worried about you," Xander explained. "Every time you coughed or shivered, I worried I had made a terrible mistake bringing you here." "I am fine," Maggie said firmly. "Better than fine. I am alive in a way I have never been before. Stop worrying." Spring came slowly, as it always did in the high country. The snow melted gradually, revealing the brown grass beneath. Ice on the lake cracked and groaned as it broke apart. Green shoots began to appear, then wildflowers, then the full glory of mountain summer. In late May, a trader came through on his way to Salida, and Maggie sent her first letter to Aunt Dorothy, assuring her that she was well and happy. The trader brought news that Dorothy had sold the boarding house and was considering moving to Denver. She was fine, he assured them, just ready for a change. Summer was glorious. Xander and Maggie explored the high country together, and she saw sights few people ever witnessed. Elk herds grazing in meadows, bear cubs playing while their mother watched, eagles soaring overhead. They fished and hunted and gathered wild berries. They made love under the stars and talked about their future. In August, Maggie realized she was pregnant. She told Xander one evening as they sat by the lake, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "As sure as I can be," Maggie said. "I have missed my courses for 2 months, and I have been sick in the mornings. My mother told me once that was how she knew with me." Xander pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squeaked in protest. "Sorry," he said, loosening his grip. "I am just so happy and terrified. Maggie, we are 2 days from the nearest town." "If something goes wrong, then we will deal with it," Maggie interrupted. "Women have been having babies in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time. We will be fine." "I am going to go to Salida tomorrow and find a midwife," Xander said. "Someone who can come up here when your time is near. I do not care what it costs." "That is a good plan," Maggie agreed. "But do not leave tomorrow. Stay with me a few more days. I want to enjoy this news with you before we start worrying about practicalities." They did just that, spending several days in a haze of happiness, planning for their child and imagining what their life would look like as a family. When Xander finally rode down to Salida, he returned 3 days later with good news. He had found a midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who agreed to come up to the cabin 2 weeks before Maggie's expected due date and stay until the baby was born. The cost was steep, nearly $50, but Xander had enough pelts saved to cover it. He also brought back supplies, including cloth for baby clothes and a cradle that Miller had built and sent up as a gift. Maggie cried when she saw the cradle, beautifully made from smooth pine wood. "I miss him," she admitted. "And Aunt Dorothy. I wish they could meet our baby." "We will bring the baby down to Salida when he or she is old enough to travel," Xander promised. "Maybe when spring comes again. It will be easier for us to travel down than for them to travel up." The fall was spent preparing not just for winter but for a new baby. Xander worked to expand the cabin slightly, adding a small addition that could serve as a nursery. It was not much, but it gave them more space. Maggie sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving expertly with needle and thread. As winter approached again, Mrs. Henderson arrived as promised, riding up on a sturdy mule with bags of medical supplies. She was a woman in her 50s, round and practical, with gray hair and kind eyes. She looked around the cabin approvingly. "You have done well up here," she said to Maggie. "Most women would not have survived their first winter. You must be tougher than you look." "I had a good teacher," Maggie said, smiling at Xander. Mrs. Henderson stayed with them through the winter, sleeping in the small addition they had built. She was good company, full of stories and advice, and Xander was grateful for her presence as Maggie grew larger and more uncomfortable. The baby came in early March during a late-season snowstorm that kept them all trapped inside. The labor was long and difficult, and Xander paced outside the cabin for hours, unable to bear listening to Maggie's cries of pain. When Mrs. Henderson finally emerged and told him he had a son, he nearly collapsed with relief. Maggie was exhausted but glowing when he entered the cabin. She held a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets, and when she pulled back the cloth to show him, Xander saw the most beautiful sight of his life. His son had dark hair like his own and appeared to have his mother's delicate features. His eyes were closed, but his tiny fists waved in the air. "He is perfect," Xander breathed, touching one impossibly small hand with his finger. The baby immediately gripped it, and Xander felt his heart nearly burst. "We need to name him," Maggie said softly. They had discussed names for months, but now that the moment was here, Xander found his mind blank. Then he remembered standing on the mountain ridge with Maggie, the day she had agreed to marry him, looking out over the wilderness. "What about Ridge?" he suggested. "For where we decided to build our life together." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "Ridge Dalton. I love it." Ridge proved to be a healthy, strong baby who rarely cried and slept well from the start. Mrs. Henderson stayed for 2 more weeks to make sure Maggie recovered properly, then rode back down to Salida with a promise to check on them when she could. Life settled into a new rhythm. Maggie handled the baby and the household chores while Xander hunted and trapped. In the evenings, Xander would hold Ridge while Maggie rested, marveling at how something so small could be so important. He sang to his son, old songs his own mother had sung to him long ago in Kansas, and watched as Ridge's eyes tracked his face with increasing focus. When spring came and the snow melted, they packed carefully and made the journey down to Salida. It took twice as long with a baby, stopping frequently to feed and change him, but they made it safely. Aunt Dorothy cried when she saw them, holding Ridge and declaring him the most beautiful baby she had ever seen. Miller came by and presented them with a carved wooden horse as a gift for Ridge. The whole town seemed to turn out to meet the mountain couple and their baby, and Xander felt overwhelmed by the attention. But Maggie glowed, showing off her son and her mountain man husband with equal pride. She told anyone who would listen about their life in the high country, about the beauty and the hardship, about how happy she was. "You look well," Dorothy said privately to Maggie. "Truly well. I worried so much, but I can see you have found your place." "I have," Maggie agreed. "Thank you for letting me go. I know it was not easy for you." "Letting go never is," Dorothy said. "But sometimes it is necessary." They stayed in Salida for a week, restocking supplies and visiting with friends. Xander sold his winter pelts for good prices and bought Maggie a set of silver combs for her hair, a luxury they could barely afford but that he wanted her to have. She protested that it was too extravagant, but her eyes lit up when she saw them. The journey back up the mountain was peaceful. Ridge slept much of the way, lulled by the horse's gentle motion. When they reached the cabin, Maggie sighed with contentment. "I know I said it before, but I mean it even more now," she said. "This is home. This is where we belong." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winter brought snow and cold and long nights by the fire. Spring brought melt and mud and new growth. Summer brought warmth and plenty and long days of sunshine. Fall brought brilliant colors and the urgent work of preparing for another winter. Ridge grew from a baby into a toddler, then a small boy. He learned to walk on the cabin's wooden floor and said his first words while sitting on Xander's lap. He was fearless, just like his mother, and Xander spent much of his time making sure the boy did not get into dangerous situations. When Ridge was 3, Maggie became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when she gave birth the following spring, it was to twin girls. They named them Ruby and Rose, and Xander joked that he was now hopelessly outnumbered. The cabin had to be expanded again to accommodate their growing family. With Miller's help, who came up for a month that summer specifically to assist, they added a second room and a proper loft. It was no longer a bachelor's rough shelter, but a real family home. Ridge proved to be a natural in the wilderness, learning to track and hunt almost as soon as he could walk. The girls were still too young, but Xander looked forward to teaching them as well. Maggie had proven that women could be just as capable as men in the mountains, and he wanted his daughters to grow up with the same confidence and skills. Money was always tight, but they managed. Xander's pelts brought in enough each year to buy necessities, and Maggie had learned to make or repair almost everything else. She sewed their clothes, preserved their food, and even learned to tan hides. Her hands, once soft, were now permanently work-roughened, but she never complained. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they left the children with Dorothy, who had moved to a small house on the outskirts of Salida, and rode back up to the ridge where Xander had first proposed. It was summer, and the wildflowers were in full bloom. "I have something for you," Xander said. pulling a small bundle from his saddlebag. Inside was a gold ring, simple but beautiful, sized to fit her finger. "Xander, we cannot afford this," Maggie protested, even as her eyes filled with tears. "I have been saving for it," Xander said. "A little bit each year. You deserved a ring when I proposed, and I wanted you to finally have one." He slipped it onto her finger, and Maggie threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the passion of their first kiss on this very spot. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I have never regretted choosing this life, not for a single moment." "I love you too," Xander said. "You saved me, you know. I did not realize how empty my life was until you filled it." "You saved me $40, Maggie said with a laugh. "I think we are even." They made love there on the mountain ridge, under the open sky, and afterward lay in each other's arms, watching clouds drift by. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Xander asked. "That the horse trader was trying to cheat me blind?" "I remember," Maggie said. "You were wrong," Xander said. "He was not trying to cheat me blind. If I had paid that $100 and never met you, that would have been the real robbery. You did not save me $40. You saved my whole life." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said," Maggie said softly, "and also completely ridiculous. But I love you for it." They stayed on the ridge until sunset, watching the sky turn colors they had no names for, then rode back to Salida to collect their children. Ridge was excited to see them, the twins too young to have missed them much, and Dorothy reported that all three had been perfect angels, which Xander suspected was an exaggeration. The years continued to pass. Ridge grew tall and strong with his father's build and his mother's quick mind. The twins developed distinct personalities. Ruby, bold and adventurous, Rose quieter and more thoughtful. Another baby came when the twins were 4, another boy they named River, and the cabin had to be expanded yet again. Life in the mountains was never easy, but it was good. There were hard winters when food ran low and everyone went to bed hungry. There was the year Ridge fell and broke his arm, and Xander had to ride for 2 straight days to fetch a doctor. There was the forest fire that came within a mile of their cabin before summer rains finally put it out. But there were also countless moments of joy. Teaching Ridge to shoot his first deer and watching the pride on the boy's face. Listening to the twins giggle as they played in the snow. Holding Maggie close on cold nights and knowing she was exactly where she wanted to be. Watching his children grow healthy and strong, confident in their abilities and in love with the wilderness. When Ridge turned 18, Xander sat him down for a serious conversation. "You are a man now," he said, "old enough to make your own choices about your life. If you want to stay here and help run the trap lines, you are welcome. But if you want to go to town, see more of the world, I will not stand in your way." Ridge did not hesitate. "I am staying," he said. "This is where I belong, though I would not mind finding myself a wife eventually, like you found Ma. Fair enough," Xander said with a smile. "We can make trips to Salida more often, let you meet some girls, did you hear that?" Ridge called to Maggie, who was cooking dinner. "Pi is going to help me find a wife. Heaven help the poor girl," Maggie said dryly, but she was smiling. Ridge did eventually find a wife, a strong, capable young woman named Sarah, who took to mountain life with the same determination Maggie had shown. They built their own cabin a few miles from Xander and Maggie's, close enough to help each other but far enough for privacy. The twins, when they were old enough, decided differently. Ruby wanted to see more of the world and moved to Denver when she was 20, finding work as a secretary and writing long letters home about city life. Rose stayed closer, marrying a rancher near Salida and visiting the mountain cabin frequently with her growing family. River, the youngest, showed every sign of being a mountain man like his father, content with the wilderness and uninterested in town life. Xander and Maggie grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but they were still strong, still capable, still deeply in love. They handed over more and more of the physical work to their children and grandchildren, but they never left the mountains they both loved. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset over the lake. Xander's arm was around Maggie's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They had made this gesture countless times over the years, but it never got old. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had paid that $100? Xander asked quietly. "Sometimes," Maggie admitted, "but not often. I figure fate would have found a way to bring us together regardless." "You really believe that?" Xander asked. "I do," Maggie said fervently. "Some people are meant to find each other. You and I were always going to end up here on this mountain watching this sunset. The horse trader was just the excuse fate used." Then I am grateful to that cheating horse trader, Xander said. Even though he tried to rob me blind. He did rob you blind, Maggie said with a laugh. He just did not know I was going to rob him right back by stealing your heart. You did not steal it, Xander corrected. I gave it to you freely. That very first day, when you ducked under the fence rail and started examining that horse like you owned the world. I was lost right then, liar, Maggie said affectionately. You thought I was interfering. Maybe at first, Xander conceded. But by the time you explained about the tendon, I was already wondering if I could find an excuse to see you again. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance an elk bugled. Closer to the cabin they could hear river chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe a familiar, comforting sound. We built a good life, Maggie said softly. A good family. I am proud of what we have created here. So am I, Xander said, though I could not have done any of it without you. Turned a lonely bachelor's cabin into a real home. You gave me children and grandchildren. You taught me that the wilderness is even more beautiful when shared with someone you love. You taught me that I was stronger than I knew, Maggie said. That I could survive anything if I was brave enough to try. That love is not about finding someone to make your life easier, but finding someone who makes the hard parts worthwhile. When did you become such a poet? Xander teased gently. I learned from the best, Maggie said. A certain mountain man who once told me that the mountains make poets of men or break them. I said that? Xander asked, surprised. You did. The first night we camped on the way up here before we were married. I have never forgotten it. Xander kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, which still smelled faintly of lavender even after all these years. I love you, Margaret Dalton, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow. That is definitely poetry, Maggie said, but her voice was thick with emotion. I love you too, Xander. Thank you for letting me into your life. Thank you for showing me the mountains. Thank you for our children and this beautiful, impossible life we have built together. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands, they sat together in the peace of the evening, two people who had found each other by chance and stayed together by choice. The wind whispered through the pine trees, the lake lapped gently at the shore, and in the cabin behind them, the fire crackled in the hearth. The horse trader had tried to cheat Xander blind, and Maggie had saved him $40. But more than that, she had saved him from a lifetime of loneliness, had given him love and family and a reason to come down from the mountains more than twice a year. She had taken his solitary existence and filled it with laughter and warmth and the kind of happiness he had not even known he was missing. And Xander, in turn, had given her the freedom and wildness she had not known she craved. He had shown her that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, that she could thrive in the harshest conditions, that she could build a life on her own terms rather than accepting the limitations others placed on her. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone. A family, a legacy, a love story that would be told by their children and grandchildren for generations to come, about the mountain man and the woman who out-haggled a cheating horse trader, saved $40, and found forever in the Colorado high country. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out below. But to Xander and Maggie, sitting together in the growing darkness, the universe felt exactly the right size, large enough to contain mountains and wilderness and endless possibilities, but small enough to fit inside the circle of each other's arms. River finished chopping wood and came inside, nodding respectfully to his parents as he passed. Through the cabin window, they could see him banking the fire for the night, moving with the easy competence they had taught him. He would take care of the place when they were gone, Xander knew. He and Ridge and Rose and all the grandchildren would keep the mountain cabin alive, would continue the legacy they had started. But that was a thought for another day. Tonight, Xander was content to sit with his wife, his partner, his best friend, and watch the stars come out over the land they both loved. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, as every tomorrow had for the past 30 years. But tonight there was peace and love and the quiet certainty that they had made the right choice all those years ago in a dusty corral in Salida. "Ready for bed?" Maggie asked eventually, as the cold began to seep through their clothes. "Always," Xander said, standing and helping her to her feet. His joints creaked now and he moved more slowly than he once had. But he was still strong, still capable of protecting his family and providing for them. Just as Maggie, Despite the silver in her hair and the lines on her face, was still the fierce, determined woman who had marched into that corral and saved him from being cheated. They went inside together, closing the cabin door against the night chill. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and their bed, the same one Xander had built when he first came to the mountains, waited for them in the corner. They undressed and climbed under the quilts Maggie had sewn, and Xander pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. "Good night, my love," Maggie murmured, already half asleep. "Good night," Xander replied, breathing in the scent of her hair one more time. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and an owl called from somewhere in the darkness. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and two people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully in each other's arms. The horse trader had tried to cheat him blind, but Maggie had saved him. She had saved him money, yes, but more importantly, she had saved him from himself, from a life half lived in isolation. And in doing so, she had found her own salvation, her own freedom, her own true home. It was a good ending to their story, Xander thought as sleep claimed him. But it was also not really an ending at all. It was just another chapter in a tale that would continue long after they were gone, told and retold by the family they had created. In the mountains they both loved, under the stars that had witnessed their love from the very beginning. The story of the mountain man and the woman with green eyes who knew horses, who had looked at each other across a dusty corral and recognized something worth fighting for, who had chosen love over comfort, challenge over ease, together over alone, and who had lived happily ever after in exactly the way they both needed, in the wild, beautiful, impossible mountains of Colorado.